It's late 1964, and a guy in a white shirt with an unlit cigar clamped between his teeth is standing in his shop in the San Fernando Valley, staring at a brand new factory Dodge race car, and thinking about how to make it faster. Not faster in any normal tuning sense. He's thinking about picking up the entire front axle and moving it forward 6 inches and doing the same thing to the rear axle and basically turning this factory drag car into something that has never existed before. And here's the thing, he's not some wild-eyed hot rodder just winging it. He's a mechanical engineer who has been building engines since he was a teenager, and he has a very specific reason why doing this to the car will work. Chrysler is about to build their own version of this same concept, and when those cars start showing up at drag strips across the country in 1965, the whole sport is going to go sideways in the best possible way. That guy is Dick Landy. And if you know anything about Mopar drag racing history, you know the name, but you might not fully know the story. Not just the racing part, but the whole thing. Because Landy wasn't just a driver. He was one of the chief experimenters in Chrysler's entire drag racing program. He was the guy who helped figure out what the 426 Hemi could actually do before almost anyone else got their hands on one. He was one of 4 people who basically invented the pro stock class. He ran a nationwide teaching program for Dodge dealers that laid the foundation for what eventually became Mopar performance parts. He did all of this simultaneously across about 2 decades, and he did it while also winning races and while also building and running his own engine shop in Northridge, California, and while never, not once, putting down that cigar. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the engineers and racers who shaped drag racing from the inside out. If you're someone who loves Mopar history, factory drag racing, and the people who built the sport from a dirt parking lot into a global phenomenon, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. So let's get into it. Dick Landy was born in March of 1937 and grew up in the San Fernando Valley, which in the 1950s was becoming one of the undeniable centers of Southern California car culture. Kids were building hot rods in driveways, racing on dry lake beds out in the desert, and the whole ecosystem of speed shops, dealerships, and impromptu race events was starting to form into something real. Landy grew up right in the middle of all of that. He studied mechanical engineering at San Fernando Valley Junior College, which already tells you something important about how his mind worked. He wasn't just a guy who liked going fast. He wanted to understand why things went fast, what the physics were, where the actual gains were hiding. After school, he went to work designing boats for water skiers, which is genuinely not the career path most people associate with drag racing legends, but whatever, it clearly worked out. A local Ford dealer named Andy Andrews hired him to build higher performance engines, and this is where things start to get interesting. Andrews didn't just give Landy a job. He gave him 2 things that would define his entire public image for the rest of his life: a racing career and the habit of always having an unlit cigar in his mouth. Landy later said he literally felt naked without one. You can find photographs of him across 4 decades of racing, and that cigar is always there, like a trademark, like punctuation. He raced Fords through the late 1950s and into 1961 out of Andrews's dealership in Venice. Pretty successful. Good results at San Fernando Raceway. People noticed. But in 1962, Chrysler dropped the 413 cubic inch max wedge cross ram engine, and everything changed. That motor was something special, and Landy recognized it immediately. He switched to a 1962 Plymouth Superstock and never looked back. Now, you might be thinking, okay, a guy switched manufacturers, so what? But this was not a small decision. You didn't just casually switch manufacturers in the factory racing game. You were making a commitment. These were factory-supported programs, meaning Chrysler was watching who performed with their cars and rewarding the best ones with better equipment, more development access, and direct relationships with the engineering team. You declared a side and you stayed on it. Landy made the commitment and it stuck for the rest of his life. His results in the Plymouth were good enough that Chrysler's racing director, Ronnie Householder, took notice. Householder ran the whole Chrysler Motorsports operation at the time, covering NASCAR, USAC, and drag racing simultaneously, which is an absolutely wild amount of responsibility for one person, and he had a very good eye for talent. Landy got factory support as early as 1962, and by 1963, he had moved up to running aluminum front-end cars, which were the serious factory weapons of that era. Chrysler was stripping weight everywhere they could, replacing steel body panels with aluminum, pulling out sound deadening, yanking anything that didn't contribute directly to going fast. These were not street cars with a few bolt-ons. These were purpose-built weapons wearing production car bodies. Here's what most people don't realize about that period. The line between a race car and a production car was getting blurrier by the month, and nobody quite knew where the boundary was supposed to be. The factories were pushing harder, the sanctioning bodies were scrambling to write rules fast enough to keep up, and the drivers who were willing to experiment at the edges of what was allowed were the ones who ended up defining what came next. Landy was absolutely one of those people. So, in 1964, Chrysler released the 426 race Hemi. Look, you've probably heard this engine described in superlatives before, and I'm going to do it again because the superlatives are genuinely earned. Hemispherical combustion chambers, massive intake and exhaust ports, dual 4-barrel carburetors on a cross-ram intake. The thing made well over 400 horsepower in its mildest street tune and considerably more in race configuration. It was also enormous and heavy, but nobody cared about that part because of what it could do on a drag strip. The combustion chamber design was not a new idea. Chrysler had been using Hemi heads since the early 1950s. But this version, this 426, was engineered specifically and almost exclusively for competition. It was not a street engine pretending to be a race engine. It was a race engine that Chrysler happened to also offer for street use if you filled out the right paperwork and convinced a dealer to sell you one. Landy received one of the very first 1964 Dodge 332-door sedans equipped with this engine, the A864 option code car, one of the earliest factory Hemi race cars ever built. And on June 12, 1964, he took it to Riverside and won the MP class. According to the Museum of American Speed, that was the first factory 426 Hemi car to win a sanctioned drag race. Let that sit for a second. The very first sanctioned drag race victory for the most famous drag racing engine in American history. That's Landy's car, Landy's win. Then in July, he set the track record at Lyons Dragstrip with an 11.14-second pass. By November, he became the first stock class car to break 130 miles per hour in the quarter mile at San Fernando. In 6 months, he had taken a brand new engine and pushed it to records that nobody had reached before. This is where it gets really interesting, because late in 1964, Landy started thinking about something that wasn't about the engine at all. He started thinking about traction. The Hemi made incredible power, but getting that power to the ground on the bias-ply tires of that era was a constant, grinding problem. Those tires were nothing like what racers have today. They were narrow, they had relatively little grip compared to modern compounds, and they were completely unforgiving when you asked them to manage 400-plus horsepower launching from a dead stop. The rear tires would break loose almost immediately, and all that power would just spin away into heat and noise instead of forward motion. The solution that kept nagging at Landy was weight transfer. Here's the basic physics of it. When a car accelerates hard, the weight shifts toward the rear of the car. That increased weight on the rear tires pushes them harder into the ground, which means more grip, which means more of the engine's power actually moves the car forward instead of spinning the tires. The harder you accelerate, the more the weight shifts, the more grip you potentially have. The trick is that the weight has to be in the right place to begin with, and the car's geometry has to allow that transfer to happen effectively. What Landy realized was that if you physically repositioned the axles under the body, moving the front axle forward and the rear axle also forward, you would change where the car's weight sat relative to the tires. The body stayed in the same position. The wheels underneath it did not. The result was a car that looked roughly like a stock Dodge from the outside, but had dramatically different weight distribution and dramatically better weight transfer at launch. The tricky part was the rulebook. The body had to stay basically stock, looking to run in the super stock classes, but the axle positions weren't specifically regulated. And Landy, being a mechanical engineer who had spent years understanding exactly where the rules said what they said, recognized that gap immediately. So he went and sourced the front suspension components from a Dodge A100 van, which used a solid axle setup, and installed them under his Dodge 330, moving the front wheels forward about 6 inches. Then he moved the rear axle forward about 8 inches. The body stayed the same. The wheelbase between the axles changed dramatically, and the whole thing looked a little bit wrong when you stepped back and looked at it, because the wheels were no longer in the positions they were supposed to be. Goofy is the word people used at the time. Kind of funny, actually. And there's your origin story for an entire class of race cars. This self-converted car is widely considered one of the very first what would eventually be called funny cars, and Landy built it independently before Chrysler had even finalized their own factory altered wheelbase program. He was about 3 months ahead of the factory. That tells you something important about how his mind worked. He wasn't waiting for permission or direction. He saw a problem, understood the physics, found the gap in the rules, and built the solution himself. Now, Chrysler was developing the same concept at the same time for the same reason, and their thinking was directly tied to what Ford was doing. Ford was planning to put their new single overhead cam 427 engine, the so-called Cammer, into lightweight Mustangs and Comets for the 1965 A/FX season. That engine was powerful, and those cars were lighter than Chrysler's bigger B-body cars. Chrysler looked at the situation and realized that simply making more power wasn't necessarily the answer. Traction was the answer. Chrysler chassis engineer Jim Thornton, who was one of the founding members of the Ram Chargers team, recognized that the tire technology of the mid-1960s simply could not put a Hemi's full power to the ground effectively. Moving weight rearward was the most practical solution available with the technology of the time. Landy put it well later. He said Chrysler's altered wheelbase plan was more effective than the new Ford engine because the biggest problem was traction, and all the extra power from the Fords just compounded their traction problems. He was right about that. More power into a traction-limited situation doesn't help. It makes the problem worse. That insight, that understanding of where the real limiting factor was, is the kind of systems-level thinking that separated the best engineers from the people who just kept bolting on bigger carburetors and wondering why they weren't going faster. So Chrysler contracted a company called Amble Wagon in the Troy, Michigan area to build the factory version of these cars. Amble Wagon normally converted ambulances and funeral coaches, which is a very specific skill set that apparently transfers surprisingly well to building race car bodies. You need precision metalwork, you need to understand how to modify a production chassis without compromising its structural integrity, and you need to work fast because nobody in this business was patient. They built approximately 12 cars total, give or take, depending on which source you believe. Dodge Garage, which is the official Stellantis heritage platform, says 6 Dodges and 6 Plymouth. Street Muscle magazine says 5 and 5. There was apparently at least one additional car built later for Bill Flynn by Dick Branstner. So the total factory-supported production was probably around 13. The exact count has never been definitively nailed down, and honestly, given how informal some of this development was, it probably never will be. The Dodge cars went to Dick Landy, Bud Fauble who raced as Honker, Roger Lindemood who raced as Color Me Gone, Dave Strickler who was Old Reliable, Bobby Harrop, and Bill Flynn. The Plymouth cars went to Ronnie Sox and Buddy Martin, Butch Lee Smith, altered-wheelbase, and a few others. These were the best Mopar racers in the country, and Chrysler gave them the most radical factory drag cars ever built at that point. Here's what most people don't realize about this list. These weren't just names on a roster. Each of these drivers had a specific relationship with Chrysler's engineering team. They weren't passive recipients of cars that showed up at their door. They were active participants in the development process, providing feedback, requesting specific modifications, and in Landy's case, often initiating the experiments himself. Landy's car was a 1965 Dodge Coronet two-door hardtop. The front wheels moved forward 10 inches. The rear axle moved forward 15 inches. The effective wheelbase dropped to about 110 inches from the standard 117, which is roughly a 5.5% alteration. The steel body was acid-dipped at a company called Automation Industries in Southern California to chemically thin the metal and reduce weight. This process is called chemical milling. You submerge the body panels in a bath of concentrated acid, and the acid eats away at the metal uniformly, making it thinner and lighter without compromising its shape. Done correctly, you can remove significant weight from body panels while keeping them structurally usable. Done incorrectly, you end up with body panels that continue deteriorating long after the acid bath is over, because if the neutralization process isn't thorough, the chemical reaction keeps going. Fiberglass panels replaced the fenders, hood, doors, instrument panel, and deck lid. The windshield was laminated. The side and rear windows were blue-tinted plexiglass with drilled ventilation holes. The front K-member was stainless steel, weighing 25 pounds less than standard. Here's a story Landy told about the acid dipping process that I absolutely love. The first body they ran through the chemical milling during daytime sent up a massive yellowish-red cloud of ferrous oxide that alarmed residents for blocks around the facility. People were calling the fire department, wondering what was happening. After that, they did all the remaining bodies at night. You can picture a bunch of guys standing around a vat of acid in the dark at 3 in the morning, trying not to inhale whatever was coming off those car bodies, making sure the neighbors didn't notice. Welcome to 1965 motorsports engineering. Nobody was filling out environmental impact assessment. They were just trying to make the cars lighter and faster before the season started. Landy personally supervised the entire process and made one specific decision that mattered enormously in the long run. He kept his body in the acid longer than the others and then ran it through an extra neutralization step using baking soda. That extra care is the reason his car held together through a full season of hard racing, while most of the other altered wheelbase bodies ended up deteriorating badly from incomplete neutralization. The acid just kept working on them, weakening the metal over time. Only about 5 of the original factory altered wheelbase cars survived to the present day. Landy's car survived because he took the extra step. He thought about what would happen after the acid bath, not just during it, and that longer view made all the difference. The engine in the car was a 426 race Hemi, and the induction setup evolved dramatically across the 1965 season. It started with dual 4-barrel carburetors on a magnesium cross ram intake. Then Landy switched to Hilborn mechanical fuel injection, which were actually listed with Mopar part numbers, so everything was technically factory approved and legal under the rules. Then they started running nitromethane mixed into the fuel. By the end of the season, the combination that had started at around 10.28 seconds at 138 miles per hour early in the year was running into the high 9.30 to 9.60 range at somewhere between 160 and 165 miles per hour depending on configuration. Different sources give slightly different peak times, but all of them are in that neighborhood, and all of them are remarkable for a car that still had stock-looking bodywork attached to it. The win record for the season was reportedly 39 out of 40 match races. One source says 38 of 40. Either way, that is a dominant season by any honest measure. NHRA officials saw these cars and basically had a moment of institutional panic. The sanctioning body was not prepared for what Chrysler had built. The altered wheelbase cars didn't fit neatly into any existing category, they pushed the limits of what superstock was supposed to mean, and they were clearly only going to get more extreme if nobody drew a line somewhere. So NHRA quickly imposed a 2% wheelbase alteration limit for the A/FX class. The Chrysler altered wheelbase cars had altered their wheelbase by about 5.5%. Done. Those cars were effectively banned from NHRA competition overnight. The NHRA was more accommodating and continued to run them in their ultra stock and factory experimentals categories. That 2% wheelbase rule became a foundational element of stock-based drag racing regulations that persisted for decades. And the cars that triggered the rule are now recognized as the origin point of the funny car class. The term funny car wasn't formalized yet when all of this was happening. Multiple people were experimenting with similar concepts simultaneously, and the history of exactly who did what first is genuinely contested, which is true of most important inventions. But the Chrysler altered wheelbase cars from 1965 are consistently credited as the moment when factory drag racing crossed from modified production cars into purpose-built racing machines. Even if the line between those categories was blurry at the time, everybody standing at a drag strip in 1965 could see that something had fundamentally changed. These cars looked vaguely like Dodges and Plymouth. But they weren't. Not really. And everyone knew it. By 1966, Landy was pushing even further into territory that had no clear name yet. He built what he called a long-nosed Dodge Dart, which was really more of a purpose-built race car with a Dart body draped over it. Square tube frame rails. Engine set back significantly in the chassis. Hillborn fuel injection on the Hemi. The whole thing weighed roughly 1,700 pounds, which is barely more than some motorcycles. Eventually they added a supercharger to the combination, and the resulting car cracked the 180-mile-per-hour barrier with a best run of 8.22 seconds at 188 miles per hour. That number in 1966 in a car that still had Dodge Dart written on the side of it was absolutely absurd. It was the kind of performance that made people at the track stop and question whether they had read the timing slip correctly. Then came the fire at Raisin City Raceway. A transmission explosion caused a fire that burned Landy's foot. He was okay in the larger picture, meaning he recovered, kept racing, kept building. But the incident crystallized something that Chrysler's racing director Bob Cahill had already been thinking about. Cahill called Landy and the team together and delivered a message that basically set the direction for the next several years. The quote, depending on which source you find, went something along the lines of "We don't sell these types of cars, so maybe we should try something else." The exact words vary, but the meaning was completely clear. Fuel-injected, supercharged, ultra-lightweight tube frame race cars with Dodge body panels loosely attached to them were not selling production cars at dealership. The people who came to watch those machines run were not buying street cars because of what they saw at the drag strip. The connection between the race program and the showroom had been stretched until it was nearly invisible. Time to refocus on something that the average Dodge buyer could actually relate to. Now, you might be thinking that sounds like a step backward, like Chrysler was pulling Landy back from the cutting edge and pointing him toward something less interesting. Here's the thing. What they refocused on was genuinely clever, and the long-term impact was arguably more significant than anything the fuel-injected supercharged Dart could have produced on its own. Bob Cahill came up with the idea for a nationwide Dodge Performance Clinic program beginning in 1967. The concept was to take Landy and a race car directly to Dodge dealerships across the country, where he would conduct live seminars on engine tuning, racing history, and driving technique for enthusiasts and dealers. Chrysler even sent Landy through speech and public relations training to prepare him for the role. The guy who had been running fuel-injected race cars on nitromethane was now getting media coaching to talk to dealership customers about their street Hemis. Look, Here's what makes this actually fascinating from a business history standpoint. Landy was surprisingly good at it. He had genuine credibility because he had actually built and raced these cars. He wasn't a hired spokesman reading off a card. He was the person who had moved the front axle forward 6 inches on his own initiative and won races with the result. When he talked about what the 426 Hemi could do, he knew from direct personal experience, and audiences could feel that difference. He estimated he reached as many as 75,000 racing enthusiasts per year across 4 years of the program. Think about the scale of that. 75,000 people per year, in person, at Dodge dealerships, hearing a genuine factory racer talk about performance, about what these engines could do, about what parts they needed. Every one of those people who came out to a dealership to hear Dick Landy talk was a potential buyer of Mopar performance parts. And here's what most people don't realize about this program. The information Landy gathered from those clinics, the questions people asked, the parts they wanted, the problems they were trying to solve on their street cars, all of that fed directly back into Chrysler's product planning. It was essentially a nationwide market research program operating in plain sight, disguised as a racing promotion. The data from those clinics became foundational to Chrysler's Hustle Stuff performance parts program in 1969, which was the direct predecessor to the Direct Connection catalog, which is ultimately what became Mopar Performance. So Landy didn't just race for Dodge. He built the feedback loop between the racetrack and the showroom that made the whole performance parts business viable. That contribution doesn't show up in a win column anywhere, but it shaped what Mopar Performance was for decades afterward. On the track during this period, he wasn't exactly standing still. He ran multiple cars simultaneously in different classes, which was typical for the top factory drivers of that era. You had to be versatile because the different classes rewarded different things, and you wanted to be competitive wherever you showed up. A 1967 Coronet in SS/B class. A 440 Coronet R/T. Then in 1968, he became one of the first drivers to receive one of the legendary L023 Hemi darts, those factory-built lightweight superstockers with the aluminum panels and over 500 horsepower jammed into a compact car body. He also campaigned a 1968 Dodge Charger R/T with the A990 Race Hemi, aluminum heads, magnesium cross-ram intake, and fiberglass body panels, weighing around 3,400 pounds, which for a full-size Charger is remarkably light. His brother Mike Landy was recruited to drive a team car, keeping things in the family. The results verified the cars were working. 1968, NHRA Winter National Street Eliminator, won it in the Charger. 1968, NHRA Winter National Street Class, running 10.49 at 133.25 miles per hour. 1969 NHRA Winter Nationals Modified Altered Eliminator, won that one too. 3 consecutive NHRA national event wins in 3 different classes over 3 years is verified, and it is genuinely impressive, because each of those classes required different cars, different setups, and different competitive strategies. Now we get to 1969 and one of the most consequential conversations in drag racing history. Dick Landy got together with Ronnie Sox, Bill Jenkins, and Don Nicholson, and they went to NHRA with a proposal. Create a new class for stock-bodied cars with big engines, running heads-up with no handicap and no breakout risk. Think about the frustration that was driving this. These were the best factory stock racers in the country, running cars that could run deep into the nines, and the existing class structure forced them into bracket-style racing with handicap starts and breakout rules that penalized you for going too fast. If you built a car that was too good, too consistent, you could lose a race by performing exactly as intended. That made no sense to these guys, and it made no sense to the crowds watching them. The fans wanted to see the fastest Chevy against the fastest Mopar, doors open, from the same starting line, first one to the stripe wins. Simple, clean, definitive. NHRA listened, and for 1970 they created Pro Stock. Landy later said he couldn't be happier about it. He'd always preferred heads-up racing, but couldn't get excited about playing catch-up against a super stock car and having to back off to avoid breaking out. Pro Stock was what he'd wanted, and the inaugural event proved immediately that this format was going to be something genuinely special. The 1970 NHRA Winter Nationals at Pomona was the first official Pro Stock race in history. Landy qualified fourth with a 10.11 second run, behind Sox at 10.00, Jenkins at 10.08, and Booth at 10.09. That qualifying field tells you everything you need to know about how competitive this class was going to be from literally day one. 4 of the best factory racers in the country separated by 1/10 of a second in qualifying at the very first event. The sport had been waiting for this format without quite knowing it. Landy red-lighted against Jenkins in the semifinals. Jenkins went on to win the first ever Pro Stock final, but the season was far from over. At the NHRA Summer Nationals at York, Pennsylvania in the summer of 1970, Landy lined up against Herb Martinez in the final round. Now, this race has been incorrectly described in various places, including on Wikipedia, as happening at the Winter Nationals, but it didn't. It was the Summer Nationals, and the details matter here because of what happened at that finish line. Martinez was devastated about the result afterward. He said Landy had him covered, but he red-lighted. And here's the detail Martinez added later that really stings. Landy had actually missed a gear on that run. So Martinez lost to a car that wasn't even running correctly. He said he should have his butt kicked to this day for going red. That is the kind of thing that haunts a racer, the moment you handed someone a win they hadn't fully earned because you made a mistake first. For Landy, it was his 3rd consecutive NHRA National Event Class win. Street Eliminator in 1968, Modified Altered in 1969, Pro Stock in 1970. 3 different classes, 3 different cars, 3 years in a row. And it was his only NHRA Pro Stock national event win. Just the one. But it happened to be the 3rd Pro Stock race ever held. So that's not nothing. This is where it gets really interesting from an engineering standpoint. Through the early 1970s, Landy kept pushing the development boundaries even as his racing results against Jenkins and Sox were inconsistent. Tom Hoover, who was the chief Hemi engineer at Chrysler and basically the father of the 426 race Hemi, gave an honest and genuinely interesting assessment of Landy years later. He said Landy liked to experiment more than the other drivers, which often meant he was 1/10 or 2 off the pace during any given event. He also noted that Landy was somewhat challenged by the manual transmission and generally spent more time with the clutch declutched than was ideal. By contrast, Ronnie Sox apparently shifted faster than an automatic transmission, according to Chrysler's own computer-based testing. So the gap between Sox and Landy in pure driving terms was real. But Hoover framed it as the natural and acceptable cost of Landy's approach. The experimenting produced data that fed back into Chrysler's development work, and that data was genuinely valuable even when it cost Landy elapsed time at specific events. He was doing something more like applied research with a race car than pure competition driving, and both things have value, but they pull in slightly different directions. For his 1971 Challenger, Landy did something that is characteristically clever and slightly unexpected. He sourced a rack and pinion steering unit from the Plymouth Cricket, which was a British-built car that Chrysler was selling in America at the time. The Cricket was a small economy car, not a performance machine in any sense, but it used a rack and pinion steering setup, which provides more precise, more direct feel than the recirculating ball steering in the Challenger. Landy recognized that the precision advantage was more important for a pro stock car than whatever else the Cricket's steering system was designed around, so he adapted it. The car was running 9.60 seconds at 145.30 miles per hour and by some accounts won the NHRA West Coast Pro Stock Championship that year, though that result is documented in enthusiast sources rather than official NHRA records, so hold that one with appropriate skepticism. Then came what might be the most elegant pure engineering move of Landy's entire career. In 1973, he had a new pro stock car built on a Kent Fuller chassis, and he made a very specific decision about the engine displacement that most people overlook. The 426 Hemi displaces 426 cubic inches. That's not a round number, and there's nothing inherently magic about it in the abstract. What Landy realized was that by using a Moldex crankshaft with a shorter stroke, he could reduce the displacement to 404 cubic inches. The NHRA's weight rules at the time assigned minimum car weights based on engine displacement. Smaller displacement meant a lower mandatory minimum weight. The power difference between a properly built 426 Hemi and a properly built 404 cubic inch Hemi was real but not dramatic. The weight difference, however, was significant, and in pro stock, where competitors are separated by hundredths of a second, that weight matters enormously. Landy was finding a lighter, faster path through the rulebook by thinking about the whole system instead of just the engine in isolation. The 404 cubic inch Dart Sport ran 9 flat at 150 miles per hour and cost $32,000 to build, which was real money in 1973. It won the 1973 NHRA Pro Stock World Championship, and then it won the 1974 NHRA Championship as well. 2 championships in 2 years with a smaller engine than anyone else was running. That's the payoff for thinking differently. 1974 also brought a genuinely weird detour that tells you something about how complicated the relationship between Chrysler and the sanctioning bodies had become. Chrysler boycotted NHRA Pro Stock that year over weight rules. They felt unfairly penalized the Hemi compared to the small block Chevy-powered cars that Bill Jenkins was running. The argument was essentially that NHRA's weight penalties for displacement were calibrated in a way that made the big-bore Hemi carry too much extra weight relative to its actual performance advantage over the smaller but more efficient small block combinations. Chrysler thought the scales were tipped wrong, and rather than compete under rules they considered unfair, they pulled out. So Landy went back to Superstock with a 1970 Challenger running the 426 Street Hemi on a 4-speed transmission. He won the Gator Nationals SS/D class and set the National SS/D record at 10.55 seconds. He also crashed his first Dart Sport that year in his only major accident across his entire career, which is pretty remarkable when you consider how many passes he made over 2 decades of hard racing at every level from match race to national event. By the mid-1970s, the factory support structures that had defined professional drag racing for the previous decade were collapsing under the weight of events that had nothing to do with drag racing. The 1973 oil embargo hit the American car industry like a sledgehammer. Emissions regulations were tightening every year, strangling the performance engines that had powered the whole factory racing program. The 55-mile-per-hour national speed limit made high performance feel culturally awkward in a new way. And Chrysler had its own severe financial problems that had nothing to do with any of that. The company was genuinely close to failure in ways that wouldn't be fully public until later in the decade. The company's formal pro stock program ended around 1973, though informal involvement continued through the Motown missile program until Don Carlton was killed in a testing accident in 1977. Tom Hoover left Chrysler in 1979. Sox and Martin's partnership ended around 1975 when the economics stopped making sense. The whole era was unwinding, and there wasn't a clear replacement coming to fill the space it left. Landy kept racing into the late 1970s with the Dart Sport updated into the 8.70-second range at over 157 miles per hour. The car was still fast and still competitive and still very much a Landy-built machine, meaning it was always slightly different from what everyone else was doing. Then he undertook one final factory program, and it might be the most technically interesting thing he ever attempted. The Dodge Omni 024. If you're a Mopar person, that name probably makes you laugh a little, because the Omni was a front-wheel drive economy car. It was Chrysler's attempt to compete with the Honda Civics and Volkswagen Rabbits that were eating Detroit's lunch in the late 1970s. Small, practical, fuel-efficient, and about as far from the 426 Hemi Challenger as anything Chrysler manufactured. But pro-stock rules in the late 1970s allowed different body styles, and the Omni 024 actually had a few things going for it as a platform. It was light. It had a short wheelbase, and Landy, being Landy, immediately saw how to make it work in ways nobody else had thought through yet. He built a pro-stock version on a Don Hardy chassis using a Chrysler LA small block engine board and stroked to 341 cubic inches. The genuinely fascinating engineering detail here is what he did to make that small block survive at the RPM levels pro-stock required. He changed the lifter bore angle in the engine block from 116 degrees to 110 degrees and completely reworked the W2 Mopar cylinder head. This modification allowed the engine to breathe more effectively at extremely high engine speeds and survive at 11,300 revolutions per minute. For context, that is an astonishing number for any naturally aspirated, production block-based engine. Modern NASCAR engines operate in that range using purpose-built blocks with decades of development behind them. Landy was getting there in the late 1970s with a modified production block, which is a genuine engineering achievement regardless of what the race results looked like. The car ran 8.42 seconds at over 161 miles per hour. Landy no longer drove competitively himself at this point. He built and prepared the car and had Brad Young and Kenny Dondro drive it. But the car worked, and the engineering behind it worked. Then the rules moved against him. When Bob Glidden's Plymouth Arrow dominated the 1979 NHRA season, running a Ford small block, NHRA adjusted the weight brake. The Fords got lighter. The Mopars stayed where they were. Landy's patience, which had survived 2 decades of sanctioning body decisions that sometimes went against him, finally ran out. His exact words were something along the lines of, "When Glidden did so well, NHRA took another half-pound off the Fords and gave it to us, and that was when I quit for good because I was sick of fighting it." That's a clear statement from a man who had spent 20 years working within systems that didn't always treat him fairly, and had finally decided that the fight wasn't worth continuing. That was the end of Dick Landy as a professional racer. He meant it, and he never went back to competition. But Dick Landy Industries kept running, and that part of the story deserves more attention than it usually gets. He had opened the shop at 19743 Bahama Street in Northridge, California around 1970, and it operated continuously for almost 4 decades. DLI wasn't a speed shop in the traditional retail sense where you could walk in and buy a set of headers off the shelf. It was a race engine development facility and performance parts manufacturer with a chassis dynamometer on site. The shop built Hemi engines for racers including Reed Wisner and Roy Hill, who used a Landy-prepared engine in his 1984 Mercury Capri Pro stock. It supplied parts directly to Daimler Chrysler Mopar Performance, B&M Automotive, and Crane Cams. The product list covered Hemi rocker gear, valve train components, stroker kits, cylinder heads, supercharger systems, sheet metal intake manifolds, and custom piston set. The shop was the continuation of everything Landy had been doing on the racetrack, except now organized into a business structure that could serve the broader Mopar community rather than just one racing team. He also edited West Coast Mopar Muscle magazine and wrote a technical diagnostic column until the end of his life. He went to the Goodwood Festival of Speed in England in 2001 and drove his restored 1974 Challenger, which is genuinely delightful, this very American guy with his unlit cigar taking his Mopar up the hill in the English countryside. At nostalgia events in his later years, people who met him consistently described a guy who was smart and funny and actually enjoyed talking about the past without going through the motions. He wasn't performing nostalgia. He was genuinely interested in the history because he had made so much of it and still cared about the details. His brother Mike was deeply involved in DLI throughout and maintained the legacy until his own death in October of 2025 at 77 years old. Dick Landy himself died on January 11, 2007, from kidney failure at age 69. He was survived by his wife Jeannie, his sons Robert and Richard, and his daughter Danette. The family asked that memorial donations go to the Wally Parks NHRA Museum and the Drag Racing Association of Women, which tells you something about his values and the community he felt most connected to. His 1964 Dodge 330, the one he drove to the first factory Hemi win in sanctioned drag racing, now lives at the Museum of American Speed in Lincoln, Nebraska, which is exactly where it belongs. The Motorsports Hall of Fame of America lists him as a nominee in the drag racing category. He's in the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame at the Don Garlits Museum in Florida. Hot Rod magazine inducted him into their Hall of Fame. The Mopar Hall of Fame took him in with the 2012 class alongside Sox and Martin. Jeff Stunkard at Cartech Books wrote the definitive biography called Landy's Dodges in 2016 with full access to the family archive and 407 photographs. If you want to go deeper into this story than any YouTube video can take you, that is where you go. ESPN wrote at the time of his death that Dick Landy never ravaged the record books with NHRA championships and rafts of national event wins. But to a generation of drag racing fans who loved race cars with doors, and especially Mopar people, the loss was deep and sorrowful. That's accurate, and it also slightly undersells the engineering contribution, which was enormous. But it captures something true about how Landy existed in the sport. He was not the most decorated driver of his era. Ronnie Sox was a faster shifter. Bill Jenkins was more consistent in pro stock. Bob Glidden dominated the late 1970s in ways Landy never approached. But here's the thing. Those guys didn't also build the cars from scratch and pioneer the chassis concepts and run the nationwide dealer program and help create the class structure and operate an engine shop that supplied parts to Mopar Performance for 4 decades. Landy did all of that simultaneously, while always having that cigar in his teeth, while being genuinely humble about it when people asked. That combination of driver and engineer and ambassador and businessman in one person is genuinely rare in the history of any motorsport. The altered wheelbase cars he was central to developing became the origin point of Funny Car. The dealer clinic program he ran became the foundation of Mopar Performance parts. The pro stock class he helped create is still on the NHRA schedule today. And his 1964 Dodge 330, the one he drove to the first factory Hemi win in sanctioned competition, is sitting in a museum in Nebraska as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most important car isn't the fastest one. It's the first one. So that's who Dick Landy was, and why the Mopar people called him Mr. Mopar, and why that nickname fit better than any trophy count ever could. If this video helped you understand the full picture of what he built and why it mattered, drop a comment below with what surprised you most. And if you're new here, this is exactly the kind of story we dig into every week on Legacy Motoring. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.